Well, I'm from Pennsylvania originally, Huntington, Pennsylvania, and came here. My father got a job teaching in Cleveland, over here at Old Fairmont High School, or junior high. And so when I was one, my mother moved to Cleveland, and then she came down with that flu epidemic and died the following winter. And then I went back to live with my grandparents until I was about 5, until my father remarried. So I was in Cleveland when I was 1 year old, and then not back again until I was about 5-year-old. I grew up, well, after 5, I grew up here. I went to Old Huff School. I do remember the old Potter Bentley building at the corner of 107th and Euclid, because my parents' school was right down from there. And I do remember when they moved up here into this building and were down on the corner, and they had a flower shop in connection with Potter. And they had a water wheel in the window, which fascinated me because it was a setting with water pouring over this wheel and flowers and so on. That was down in where Seglins are now. I went to Saturday morning classes at the museum from 5 on. And at that time, the museum had a program every Saturday afternoon for, well, anybody could come in, but as a kid, I went to this every Saturday afternoon. And between the class in the morning and when this would start, I think it was around 2 o'clock, I'd roam the museum there were always some other kids that would be there too, and we got to know the museum collection very, very well, and I was fascinated by that. I'm not sure the date, but Millikan had a gold show that when he got pieces from all over the world, and that was quite fascinating. So that related to my becoming interested in, and I always liked little things. I mean, jewelry fascinated me, but I never had any idea that I was ever going to get involved with it. I wanted to be a stage designer, and I did some stage sets in Shaker. I didn't want to go to college, and I wanted to go to the art school. I hadn't any idea what I wanted to do, but I liked painting. I didn't want to go to college, and I wanted to go to the art school. I hadn't any idea what I wanted to do, but I liked painting, and we got to know each other that way. I found out that Fred did jewelry. Pretty fantastic pieces at that time. I mean, technically they were amazing. I said, could you teach me how to solder? And I just began making jewelry, rings, because my mother's friends would buy them and so on, and it was a hobby. I really was seriously interested in painting. I asked Fred whether he could show me how to solder, and we worked in his apartment, rooming house, and on a card table with an alcohol lamp for fire and a mouth blowtorch, and I started making jewelry. My mother could sell it to her friends, and it was Depression times, and this was welcome money coming in. Both Fred and I decided that we'd take industrial design. I majored in industrial design, but Fred majored in teacher training. But he took industrial design as his secondary course. And I had no intention of being an industrial designer. I'd had Victor Schreckengast in the second year as my major design teacher. And I thought he knew a lot of secrets that I would like to learn about design. And I thought, though I'm not going to be an industrial designer, I'm going to take his design course and learn from him. I thought he was the teacher I wanted to be with for the next 2 years. But we each did 2 enamel ashtrays, and that was my introduction to enamel. And then I didn't do any more enameling until eventually, while I was in art school, I bought a little tiny kiln, and I began doing some jewelry that incorporated little enamel plaques and that sort of thing with silver. But then I went in the Army, and I went to Fort Knox, became a tank driver, but I took a little kit of jewelry tools along, and I would make jewelry for the soldiers, rings and so on, for girlfriends and so on. So that I kept working during the war. Still a major interest was painting. I thought, and I still think, painting is a much more deep and really fulfilling art than making jewelry. After Fred started working here, we would work here sometimes in the shop in the evening, and I would be making rings and things like that while he was doing more ambitious pieces, hollowware. I loved silver and work in silver. I didn't work in gold hardly at all. I thought it was too expensive. It was $45 an ounce in those days. But even that seemed like a lot to me. And when I did use it, I used it too thin. And I just didn't like gold. With silver, I felt free to use it heavy and so on. Charles Bartlett Jeffrey was an enamelist. And he didn't do any silver himself, he just did enamels. So he asked me to do a silver cross that would be with an enamel that he did for this centerpiece of this cross. And it went into the May show, and it was a very simple job, but it won first prize in metal, I guess in jewelry, in the May show. I tried to keep on painting, and I did paint quite a bit, but I found it more and more difficult to paint after teaching a whole day at night in a studio. But I found that I could make jewelry at night after a full day's teaching, and it was relaxing, and I had a lot of fun doing it. Little by little, I got away from painting and mainly went into making the jewelry. I got involved with sea creatures and bugs and beetles and things like that suggested forms where granulation would be appropriate. And I did some things that sort of looked beetle-ish because I could make forged wire that would be the legs and so on of spiders or beetles, and it would still be strong enough that you could wear it as a piece of jewelry and it wouldn't bend out of shape. It was just sort of a natural transition from that. I think the first things that I made were some earrings that were spiders with legs, and the body was granulated. And so that's just started out and kept on going. Well, I did a lot with fragments too, like fragments of stone or rock, and a lot of different, and they were applications where the same granulation process I found could be used to join fairly large pieces of gold rather than using solder. And so that became a part of my technique. Right after the war, I taught a lot of different things. I taught perspective and nature research and techniques and things of that sort. And so I started then teaching design. And that's what I taught, the major thing that I taught throughout the time I was at art school, which was almost 40 years. But after Fred stopped teaching over there, teaching the metal course, I went over and I went to teaching one day of jewelry and metal. I've met him first when Fred came here and started working. Mr. Potter was still here. And at that time, he was doing still some rings with enamel and that sort of thing. And he was also, he'd been around a long time, so there was some of his jewelry coming back to be repaired. And it was very difficult for somebody that hadn't made it to know how to do it, so that he did a lot of repair. John Marshall is retired now, but he went to University of Washington in Seattle and was head of the metals department there until he retired. He was a student of both Fred and mine, and he was a design student of mine. And Jim was always a very, very serious student. You know, he took his schooling very, very seriously. Well, while he was at Syracuse, he did some beautiful pieces of gold. Necklace that was very spectacular. And he's just a consummate designer. This is one of Fred's pendants. Fred and Jack used to go to Europe every spring on a buying trip, and they wanted Potter Mellon to have things that you couldn't buy anyplace else in Cleveland. And actually, a lot of them you couldn't buy anyplace else except if you went to New York and hunted them up. And so they really built a big interest here in Cleveland in Scandinavian design, from furniture, which they used to have here, to glass and pottery and orifice. But how it relates to this, Fred found a jeweler well, he was a stone cutter in Germany who did these unusual cut stones. Name was Munsteiner. He's still working. But Fred became fascinated with his cuts, and both this piece and this piece are these unusual stones they were always irregular cuts, and nobody else did anything like them at that time, any place. And so Fred bought these stones back. Fred did a lot of pieces for Potter Mellon himself. I mean, he had some very good jewelers working with him here at Potter Mellon, but he did a lot of pieces. And Mr. Potter had collected a lot of Chinese jades that were spectacular. And I think there's still some upstairs, but Fred would take them one by one and develop pieces for the Christmas sales of those. The only time I ever worked here, I would work during Christmas season on doing renderings for Fred, because he needed renderings of the designs that he was working up to show people. And I used to do a lot of the catalogs. I'd do the layout for Potter Mellon catalogs, because during the war I finally got involved with training literature department at Fort Knox, and I was introduced to all sorts of things that I'd never done anything like before, but layout and photography and composition and books and posters and so on. So I got involved with that here at Potter Mellon. Little by little, then, colleges everywhere began having metal shows. This is the only collaborative piece that Fred and I ever did, and it was done for Karen Howard Stern, or Howard commissioned it for some special day for Kara. And I knew Kara was very fond of butterflies. Her father got her involved with butterflies way back. So I did the enamel part of it, and Fred did the design of the whole unit, and did the silver. But it's the only one that we both collaborated on. And the one thing that's unusual about it, the enameling is done on fine silver, or pure silver. And in order to do it, I had to develop a way to make the fusion work between gold and silver to do the patterns of the butterflies and so on. And I found that I could do it in a kiln at a certain temperature if I was very careful. So I spent several weeks on each one of these after the silver form was made, gluing all of the little gold pieces to make the butterflies on it, and then put it in the kiln and prayed that it was going to work, because I'd never done anything like it before, and I've never done anything like it since. But that was our one collaborative venture.